Chapter 18. Sparrows on the Housetops. "I've often regretted," said Blenkiron, "that miracles have left off happening." He got no answer, for I was feeling the walls for something in the nature of a window. "For I reckon," he went on, "that it wants a good old-fashioned copper-bottom miracle to get us out of this fix. It's plumb against all my principles. I've spent my life using the talents God gave me to keep things from getting to the point of rude violence, and so far I've succeeded. But now you come along, Major, and you hustle a respectable middle-aged citizen into an aboriginal mix-up. It's mighty indelicate. I reckon the next move is up to you, for I'm no good at the housebreaking stunt." "No more am I," answered, "but I'm hanged if I'll chuck up the sponge. Sandy's somewhere outside, and he's got a hefty crowd at his heels." I simply could not feel the despair which by every law of common sense was due to the case. The guns had intoxicated me. I could still hear their deep voices, though yards of wood and stone separated us from the upper air. What vexed us most was our hunger. Barring a few mouthfuls on the road, we had eaten nothing since the morning, and as our diet for the past days had not been generous, we had some leeway to make up. Stoom had never looked near us since we were shoved into the car. We had been brought to some kind of house, and bundled into a place like a wine cellar. It was pitch dark, and after feeling round the walls, first on my feet and then on Peter's back, I decided that there were no windows. It must have been lit and ventilated by some lattice in the ceiling. There was not a stick of furniture in the place, nothing but a damp earth floor and bare stone sides. The door was a relic of the Iron Age, and I could hear the paces of a sentry outside it. When things get to the pass that nothing you can do can better them, the only thing is to live for the moment. All three of us sought in sleep a refuge from our empty stomachs. The floor was the poorest kind of bed, but we rolled up our coats for pillows and made the best of it. Soon I knew by Peter's regular breathing that he was asleep, and presently I followed him. I was awakened by a pressure below my left ear. I thought it was Peter, for it is the old hunter's trick of waking a man so that he makes no noise. But another voice spoke. It told me that there was no time to lose, and to rise and follow, and the voice was the voice of Hussein. Peter was awake, and we stirred Blenkiron out of heavy slumber. We were bidden take off our boots and hang them by their laces round our necks, as country boys do when they want to go barefoot. Then we tiptoed to the door, which was ajar. Outside was a passage with a flight of steps at one end, which led to the open air. On these steps lay a faint shine of starlight, and by its help I saw a man huddled up at the foot of them. It was our sentry, neatly and scientifically gagged and tied up. The steps brought us to a little courtyard about which the walls of the house rose like cliffs. We halted while Hussein listened intently. Apparently the coast was clear, and our guide led us to one side, which was clothed by a stout wooden trellis. Once it may have supported fig trees, but now the plants were dead, and only withered tendrils and rotten stumps remained. It was child's play for Peter and me to go up that trellis, but it was the deuce and all for Blenkiron. He was in poor condition, and puffed like a grampus, and he seemed to have no sort of head for heights. But he was as game as a buffalo, and started in gallantly till his arms gave out, and he fairly stuck. So Peter and I went up on each side of him, taking an arm apiece, as I had once seen done to a man with vertigo in the kloof chimney on Table Mountain. I was mighty thankful when I got him panting on the top, and Hussein had shinnied up beside us. We crawled along a broadish wall, with an inch or two of powdery snow on it, and then up a sloping buttress on to the flat roof of the house. It was a miserable business for Blenkiron, who would certainly have fallen if he could have seen what was below him, and Peter and I had to stand to attention all the time. Then began a more difficult job. Hussein pointed out a ledge which took us past a stack of chimneys to another building slightly lower, this being the route he fancied. At that I sat down resolutely and put on my boots, and the others followed. Frostbitten feet would be a poor asset in this kind of travelling. It was a bad step for Blenkiron, and we only got him past it by Peter and I spread-eagling ourselves against the wall, and passing him in front of us with his face towards us. We had no grip, and if he had stumbled we should all three have been in the courtyard. But we got it over, and dropped as softly as possible onto the roof of the next house. Hussein had his finger on his lips, and I soon saw why. for there was a lighted window in the wall we had descended. Some imp prompted me to wait behind and explore. The others followed Hussein and were soon at the far end of the roof, where a kind of wooden pavilion broke the line, while I tried to get a look inside. The window was curtained, and had 2 folding sashes which clasped in the middle. Through a gap in the curtain I saw a little lamp-lit room, and a big man sitting at a table littered with papers. I watched him, fascinated, as he turned to consult some document, and made a marking on the map before him. Then he suddenly rose, stretched himself, cast a glance at the window, and went out of the room, making a great clatter in descending the wooden staircase. He left the door ajar, and the lamp burning. I guessed he had gone to have a look at his prisoners, in which case the show was up. But what filled my mind was an insane desire to get a sight of his map. It was one of those mad impulses which utterly cloud right reason, a thing independent of any plan, a crazy leap in the dark. But it was so strong that I would have pulled that window out by its frame, if need be, to get to that table. There was no need, for the flimsy clasp gave at the first pull, and the sashes swung open. I scrambled in, after listening for steps on the stairs. I crumpled up the map and stuck it in my pocket, as well as the paper from which I had seen him copying. Very carefully I removed all marks of my entry, brushed away the snow from the boards, pulled back the curtain, got out, and refastened the window. Still there was no sound of his return. Then I started off to catch up the others. I found them shivering in the roof pavilion. "We've got to move pretty fast," I said, "for I've just been burgling old Stum's private cabinet. Hussein, my lad, do you hear that? They may be after us any moment, so I pray heaven we soon strike better going." Hussein understood. He led us at a smart pace from one roof to another, for here they were all of the same height, and only low parapets and screens divided them. We never saw a soul, for a winter's night is not the time you choose to saunter on your housetop. I kept my ears open for trouble behind us, and in about 5 minutes I heard it. A riot of voices broke out, with one louder than the rest, and looking back I saw lanterns waving. Stum had realized his loss, and found the tracks of the thief. Hussein gave one glance behind, and then hurried us on at a breakneck pace, with old Blinkiron gasping and stumbling. The shouts behind us grew louder, as if some eye quicker than the rest had caught our movement in the starlit darkness. It was very evident that if they kept up the chase we should be caught, for Blinkiron was about as useful on a roof as a hippo. Presently we came to a big drop, with a kind of ladder down it, and at the foot a shallow ledge running to the left into a pit of darkness. Hussein gripped my arm and pointed down it. "Follow it," he whispered, "and you will reach a roof which spans a street. Cross it, and on the other side is a mosque. Turn to the right there, and you will find easy going for 50 meters, well screened from the higher roofs. For Allah's sake, keep in the shelter of the screen. Somewhere there I will join you." He hurried us along the ledge for a bit, and then went back, and with snow from the corners covered up our tracks. After that he went straight on himself, taking strange short steps like a bird. I saw his game. He wanted to lead our pursuers after him, and he had to multiply the tracks, and trust to Stum's fellows not spotting that they were all made by one man. But I had quite enough to think of in getting Blinkiron across that ledge. He was pretty nearly foundered. He was in a sweat of terror, and as a matter of fact he was taking one of the biggest risks of his life, for we had no rope, and his neck depended on himself. I could hear him invoking some unknown deity called Holy Mike. But he ventured gallantly, and we got to the roof which ran across the street. That was easier, though ticklish enough, but it was no joke skirting the cupola of that infernal mosque. At last we found the parapet and breathed more freely, for we were now under shelter from the direction of danger. I spared a moment to look round, and 30 yards off, across the street, I saw a weird spectacle. The hunt was proceeding along the roofs parallel to the one we were lodged on. I saw the flicker of the lanterns, waved up and down as the bearers slipped in the snow, and I heard their cries like hounds on a trail. Stum was not among them. He had not the shape for that sort of business. They passed us and continued to our left, now hid by a jutting chimney, now clear to view against the skyline. The roofs they were on were perhaps 6 feet higher than ours, so even from our shelter we could mark their course. If Hussein were going to be hunted across Erzurum, it was a bad lookout for us, for I hadn't the foggiest notion where we were, or where we were going to. But as we watched we saw something more. The wavering lanterns were now 300 or 400 yards away, but on the roofs just opposite us across the street there appeared a man's figure. I thought it was one of the hunters, and we all crouched lower, and then I recognized the lean agility of Hussein. He must have doubled back, keeping in the dusk to the left of the pursuit, and taking big risks in the open places. But there he was now, exactly in front of us, and separated only by the width of the narrow street. He took a step backward, gathered himself for a spring, and leaped clean over the gap. Like a cat he lighted on the parapet above us, and stumbled forward with the impetus right on our heads. "We are safe for the moment," he whispered, "but when they miss me they will return. We must make good haste." The next half-hour was a maze of twists and turns, slipping down icy roofs and climbing icier chimney-stacks. The stir of the city had gone, and from the black streets below came scarcely a sound, but always the great tattoo of guns beat in the east. Gradually we descended to a lower level, till we emerged on the top of a shed in a courtyard. Hussein gave an odd sort of cry, like a demented owl, and something began to stir below us. It was a big covered wagon, full of bundles of forage, and drawn by 4 mules. As we descended from the shed into the frozen litter of the yard, a man came out of the shade and spoke low to Hussein. Peter and I lifted Blinkiron into the cart, and scrambled in beside him, and I never felt anything more blessed than the warmth and softness of that place after the frosty roofs. I'd forgotten all about my hunger, and only yearned for sleep. Presently the wagon moved out of the courtyard into the dark streets. Then Blinkiron began to laugh, a deep internal rumble which shook him violently and brought down a heap of forage on his head. I thought it was hysterics, the relief from the tension of the past hour. But it wasn't. His body might be out of training, but there was never anything the matter with his nerves. He was consumed with honest merriment. "Say, Major," he gasped, "I don't usually cherish dislikes from my fellow men, but somehow I didn't cotton to Colonel Stoom. But now I almost love him. You hit his jaw very bad in Germany, and now you've annexed his private file, and I guess it's important, or he wouldn't have been so mighty set on steeplechasing over those roofs. I haven't done such a thing since I broke into Neighbor Brown's woodshed to steal his tame possum, and that's 40 years back. It's the first piece of genuine amusement I've struck in this game, and I haven't laughed so much since old Jim Hooker told the tale of Cousin Sally Dillard when we were hunting ducks in Michigan, and his wife's brother had an apoplexy in the night, and died of it." To the accompaniment of Blinkiron's chuckles, I did what Peter had done in the first minute, and fell asleep. When I woke it was still dark. The wagon had stopped in a courtyard which seemed to be shaded by great trees. The snow lay deeper here, and by the feel of the air we had left the city and climbed to higher ground. There were big buildings on one side, and on the other what looked like the lift of a hill. No lights were shown. The place was in profound gloom, but I felt the presence near me of others besides Hussein and the driver. We were hurried, Blinkiron only half awake, into an outbuilding, and then down some steps to a roomy cellar. There Hussein lit a lantern, which showed what had once been a storehouse for fruit. Old husks still strewed the floor, and the place smelt of apples. Straw had been piled in corners for beds, and there was a rude table and a divan of boards covered with sheepskins. "Where are we?" I asked Hussein. "In the house of the master," he said. "You will be safe here, but you must keep still till the master comes." "Is the Frankish lady here?" I asked. Hussein nodded, and from a wallet brought out some food, raisins and cold meat and a loaf of bread. We fell on it like vultures, and as we ate, Hussein disappeared. I noticed that he locked the door behind him. As soon as the meal was ended, the others returned to their interrupted sleep. But I was wakeful now, and my mind was sharp set on many things. I got Blinkiron's electric torch and lay down on the divan to study Stoom's map. The first glance showed me that I had lit on a treasure. It was the staff map of the Erzurum defences, showing the forts and the field trenches, with little notes scribbled in Stoom's neat small handwriting. I got out the big map which I had taken from Blinkiron, and made out the general lie of the land. I saw the horseshoe of Devi Boyan to the east, which the Russian guns were battering. Stoom's was just like the kind of squared artillery map we used in France, 1 in 10,000, with spidery red lines showing the trenches, but with the difference that it was the Turkish trenches that were shown in detail, and the Russian only roughly indicated. The thing was really a confidential plan of the whole Erzurum enceinte, and would be worth untold gold to the enemy. No wonder Stoom had been in a wax at its loss. The Deviboyan lines seemed to be monstrously strong, and I remembered the merits of the Turk as a fighter behind strong defences. It looked as if Russia were up against a second Plevna or New Gallipoli. Then I took to studying the flanks. South lay the Palatukan range of mountains, with forts defending the passes, where ran the roads to Mush and Lake Van. That side, too, looked pretty strong. North in the valley of the Euphrates I made out two big forts, Tafta and Karagubek, defending the road from Olti. On this part of the map Stoom's notes were plentiful, and I gave them all my attention. I remembered Blenkiron's news about the Russians advancing on a broad front, for it was clear that Stoom was taking pains about the flank of the fortress. Karagubek was the point of interest. It stood on a rib of land between two peaks, from which the contour lines rose very steep. So long as it was held, it was clear that no invader could move down the Euphrates glen. Stoom had appended a note to the peaks, "Not fortified," and about 2 miles to the northeast there was a red cross and the name Przewalski. I assumed that to be the farthest point yet reached by the right wing of the Russian attack. Then I turned to the paper from which Stoom had copied the jottings onto his map. It was typewritten, and consisted of notes on different points. One was headed Karagubek, and read, "No time to fortify adjacent peaks. Difficult for enemy to get batteries there, but not impossible. This is the real point of danger, for if Przewalski wins the peaks, Karagubek and Tafka must fall, and the enemy will be on left rear of Deviboyan main position." I was soldier enough to see the tremendous importance of this note. On Karagubek depended the defence of Erzurum, and it was a broken reed, if one knew where the weakness lay. Yet, searching the map again, I could not believe that any mortal commander would see any chance in the adjacent peaks, even if he thought them unfortified. That was information confined to the Turkish and German staff. But if it could be conveyed to the Grand Duke, he would have Erzurum in his power in a day. Otherwise he would go on battering at the Deviboyan ridge for weeks, and long ere he won it the Gallipoli divisions would arrive. He would be outnumbered by 2 to 1, and his chance would have vanished. My discovery set me pacing up and down that cellar in a perfect fever of excitement. I longed for wireless, a carrier pigeon, an aeroplane, anything to bridge over that space of 6 miles between me and the Russian lines. It was maddening to have stumbled on vital news and to be wholly unable to use it. How could 3 fugitives in a cellar, with the whole hornet's nest of Turkey and Germany stirred up against them, hope to send this message of life and death? I went back to the map and examined the nearest Russian positions. They were carefully marked. Przewalski in the north, the main force beyond Deviboyan, and the southern columns up to the passes of the Palatukan, but not yet across them. I could not know which was nearest to us till I discovered where we were. And as I thought of this, I began to see the rudiments of a desperate plan. It depended on Peter, now slumbering like a tired dog on a couch of straw. Hussein had locked the door, and I must wait for information till he came back. But suddenly I noticed a trap in the roof, which had evidently been used for raising and lowering the cellar's doors. It looked ill-fitting, and might be unbarred, so I pulled the table below it, and found that with a little effort I could raise the flap. I knew I was taking immense risks, but I was so keen on my plan that I disregarded them. After some trouble I got the thing prized open, and catching the edges of the hole with my fingers, raised my body and got my knees on the edge. It was the outbuilding of which our refuge was the cellar, and it was half filled with light. Not a soul was there, and I hunted about till I found what I wanted. This was a ladder leading to a sort of loft, which in turn gave access to the roof. Here I had to be very careful, for I might be overlooked from the high buildings, but by good luck there was a trellis for grapevines across the place, which gave a kind of shelter. Lying flat on my face, I stared over a great expanse of country. Looking north, I saw the city in a haze of morning smoke, and beyond, the plain of the Euphrates and the opening at the glen where the river left the hills. Up there, among the snowy heights, were Tafta and Karagubek. To the east was the ridge of Deviboyan, where the mist was breaking before the winter's sun. On the roads up to it I saw transport moving. I saw the circle of the inner forts, but for a moment the guns were silent. South rose a great wall of white mountains, which I took to be the Palatukan. I could see the roads running to the passes, and the smoke of camps and horse lines right under the cliffs. I had learned what I needed. We were in the outbuildings of a big country house, 2 or 3 miles south of the city. The nearest point of the Russian front was somewhere in the foothills of the Politukin. As I descended I heard, thin and faint and beautiful, like the cry of a wild bird, the muezzin from the minarets of Erzurum. When I dropped through the trap, the others were awake. Hussein was setting food on the table, and viewing my descent with anxious disapproval. "It's all right," I said. "I won't do it again, for I've found out all I wanted. Peter, old man, the biggest job of your life is before you."
Chapter 19. Greenmantle. Peter scarcely looked up from his breakfast. "I'm willing, Dick," he said, "but you mustn't ask me to be friends with Stum. He makes my stomach cold, that one." For the first time he had stopped calling me Cornelis. The day of make-believe was over for all of us. "Not to be friends with him," I said, "but to bust him and all his kind." "Then I'm ready," said Peter cheerfully. "What is it?" I spread out the maps on the divan. There was no light in the place but Blenkiron's electric torch, for Hassan had put out the lantern. Peter got his nose into the things at once, for his intelligence work in the Boer War had made him handy with maps. It didn't want much telling from me to explain to him the importance of the one I had looted. "That news is worth many a £1,000,000, said he, wrinkling his brows, and scratching delicately the tip of his left ear. It was a way he had when he was startled. "How can we get it to our friends?" Peter cogitated. "There is but one way. A man must take it. Once, I remember, when we fought for the Matabele, it was necessary to find out whether the chief Makapan was living. Some said he had died, others that he'd gone over the Portuguese border, but I believed he lived. No native could tell us, and since his kraal was well defended, no runner could get through. So it was necessary to send a man." Peter lifted up his head and laughed. "The man found the chief Makapan. He was very much alive, and made good shooting with a shotgun. But the man brought the chief Makapan out of his kraal and handed him over to the mounted police. You remember Captain Arcole, Dick? Jim Arcole? Well, Jim laughed so much that he broke open a wound in his head, and had to have a doctor." "You were that man, Peter," I said. "Jah, I was the man. There are more ways of getting into kraals than there are ways of keeping people out. Will you take this chance?" "For certain, Dick. I am getting stiff with doing nothing, and if I sit in houses much longer I shall grow old. A man bet me £5 on the ship that I could not get through a trench line, and if there had been a trench line handy I would have taken him on." "I will be very happy, Dick, but I do not say I will succeed. It is new country to me, and I will be hurried, and hurry makes bad stalking." I showed him what I thought the likeliest place, in the spurs of the Palantuken Mountains. Peter's way of doing things was all his own. He scraped earth and plaster out of a corner, and sat down to make a little model of the landscape on the table, following the contours of the map. He did it extraordinarily neatly, for, like all great hunters, he was as deft as a weaver bird. He puzzled over it for a long time, and coned the map till it must have got it by heart. Then he took his field-glasses, a very good single Zeiss, which was part of the spoils from Ruster's motor car, and announced that he was going to follow my example and get on to the house top. Presently his legs disappeared through the trap, and Blenkiron and I were left to our reflections. Peter must have found something uncommon interesting, for he stayed on the roof the better part of the day. It was a dull job for us, since there was no light, and Blencarin had not even the consolation of a game of patience. But for all that he was in good spirits, for he had had no dyspepsia since we left Constantinople, and announced that he believed he was at last getting even with his darn Judaism. As for me, I was pretty restless, for I could not imagine what was detaining Sandy. It was clear that our presence must have been kept secret from Hilda von Einem, for she was a pal of Stum's, and he must by now have blown the gaff on Peter and me. How long could this secrecy last? I asked myself. We had now no sort of protection in the whole outfit. Rasta and the Turks wanted our blood, so did Stum and the Germans, and once the lady found we were deceiving her, she would want it most of all. Our only hope was Sandy, and he gave no sign of his existence. I began to fear that with him too things had miscarried. And yet I wasn't really depressed, only impatient. I could never again get back to the beastly stagnation of that Constantinople week. The guns kept me cheerful. There was the devil of a bombardment all day, and the thought that our allies were thundering there, half a dozen miles off, gave me a perfectly groundless hope. If they burst through the defence, Hilda von Einem and her prophet and all our enemies would be overwhelmed in the deluge, and that blessed chance depended very much on old Peter, now brooding like a pigeon on the housetops. It was not till the late afternoon that Hudson appeared again. He took no notice of Peter's absence, but lit a lantern and set it on the table. Then he went to the door and waited. Presently a light step fell on the stairs, and Hudson drew back to let someone enter. He promptly departed, and I heard the key turn in the lock behind him. Sandy stood there, but a new Sandy who made Blencarin and me jump to our feet. The pelts and skin cap had gone, and he wore instead a long linen tunic clasped at the waist by a broad girdle. A strange green turban adorned his head, and as he pushed it back I saw that his hair had been shaved. He looked like some acolyte, a weary acolyte, for there was no spring in his walk or nerve in his carriage. He dropped numbly on the divan and laid his head in his hands. The lantern showed his haggard eyes with dark lines beneath them. "Good God, old man, have you been sick?" I cried. "Not sick," he said hoarsely. "My body is right enough, but the last few days I have been living in hell." Blencarin nodded sympathetically. That was how he himself would have described the company of the lady. I marched across to him and gripped both his wrists. "Look at me," I said, "straight in the eyes." His eyes were like a sleepwalker's, unwinking, unseeing. "Great heavens, man, you've been drugged," I said. "Drugged?" he cried, with a weary laugh. "Yes, I have been drugged, but not by any physic. No one has been doctoring my food. But you can't go through hell without getting your eyes red hot." I kept my grip on his wrists. "Take your time, old chap, and tell us about it. Blencarin and I are here, and old Peter's on the roof not far off. We'll look after you." "It does me good to hear your voice, Dick," he said. "It reminds me of clean, honest things. They'll come back, never fear. We're at the last lap now. One more spurt and it's over. You've got to tell me what the new snag is. Is it that woman?" He shivered like a frightened colt. "Woman?" he cried. "Does a woman drag a man through the nether pit? She is a she-devil. "Oh, it isn't madness that's wrong with her. She's as sane as you and as cool as Blenkerin. Her life is an infernal game of chess, and she plays with souls for pawns. She is evil, evil, evil!" And once more he buried his head in his hands. It was Blenkerin who brought sense into this hectic atmosphere. His slow, beloved drawl was an antiseptic against nerves. "Say, boy," he said, "I feel just like you about the lady. But our job is not to investigate her character. Her maker will do that good and sure some day. We've got to figure how to circumvent her, and for that you've got to tell us what exactly's been occurring since we parted company." Sandy pulled himself together with a great effort. "Greenmantle died that night I saw you. We buried him secretly by her order in the garden of the villa. Then came the trouble about his successor. The 4 ministers would not be no party to a swindle. They were honest men, and vowed that their task now was to make a tomb for their master, and pray for the rest of their days at his shrine. They were as immovable as a granite hill, and she knew it. Then they too died." "Murdered?" I gasped. "Murdered, all 4 in one morning. I do not know how, but I helped to bury them. Oh, she had Germans and Kurds to do her foul work, but their hands were clean compared to hers. Pity me, Dick, for I have seen honesty and virtue put to the shambles, and have abetted the deed when it was done. It will haunt me to my dying day." I did not stop to console him, for my mind was on fire with his news. "Then the prophet is gone, and the humbug is over," I cried. "The prophet still lives. She has found a successor." He stood up in his linen tunic. "Why do I wear these clothes? Because I am Greenmantle. I am the Kaaba-i-Harrier for all Islam. In 3 days' time I will reveal myself to my people, and wear on my breast the green ephod of the prophet." He broke off with an hysterical laugh. "Only you see I won't. I will cut my throat first." "Cheer up," said Blenkerin soothingly. "We'll find some prettier way than that." "There is no way," he said. "No way but death. We're done for, all of us. Hasn't got you out of Stum's clutches, but you're in danger every moment. At the best you have 3 days, and then you too will be dead." I had no words to reply. This change in the bold and unshakable Sandy took my breath away. "She made me her accomplice," he went on. "I should have killed her on the graves of those innocent men. But, instead, I did all she asked, and joined in her game. She was very candid, you know. She cares no more than envy for the faith of Islam. She can laugh at it, but she has her own dreams, and they consume her as a saint is consumed by his devotion. She has told me them, and if the day in the garden was hell, the days since have been the innermost fires of Tophet. I think it is horrible to say it, that she has got some kind of crazy liking for me. When we have reclaimed the East, I am to be by her side when she rides on her milk-white horse into Jerusalem. And there have been moments, only moments, I swear to God, when I have been fired myself by her madness." Sandy's figure seemed to shrink, and his voice grew shrill and wild. It was too much for Blenkerin. He indulged in a torrent of blasphemy, such as I believe had never before passed his lips. "I'm blessed if I'll listen to this God-darned stuff. It isn't delicate. You get busy, Major, and pump some sense into your afflicted friend." I was beginning to see what had happened. Sandy was a man of genius, as much as anybody I ever struck, but he had the defects of such high-strung, fanciful souls. He would take more than mortal risks, and you couldn't scare him by any ordinary terror. But let his old conscience get cross-eyed, let him find himself in some situation which in his eyes involved his honour, and he might go stark crazy. The woman who roused in me and Blinkerton only hatred could catch his imagination and stir in him, for the moment only, an unwilling response, and then came bitter and morbid repentance, and the last desperation. It was no time to mince matters. "Sandy, you old fool," I cried, "be thankful you have friends to keep you from playing the fool. You saved my life at Lewes, and I'm jolly well going to get you through this show. I'm bossing the outfit now, and for all your profounded prophetic manners, you've got to take your orders from me. You aren't going to reveal yourself to your people, and still less are you going to cut your throat. Greenmantle will avenge the murder of his ministers, and make that bedlamite woman sorry she was born. We're going to get clear away, and inside of a week we'll be having tea with the Grand Duke Nicholas." I wasn't bluffing. Puzzled as I was about ways and means, I had still the blind belief that we should win out. And as I spoke, 2 legs dangled through the trap, and a dusty and blinking Peter descended in our midst. I took the mats from him and spread them on the table. "First, you must know what we've had an almighty piece of luck. Last night Husband took us for a walk over the roofs of Erzurum, and by the blessing of Providence I got into Stum's room, and bagged his staff map. Look there. Do you see his notes? That's the danger point of the whole defence. Once the Russians get that fort, Kara Gubek, they've turned the main position. And it can be got, Stum knows it can, for these 2 adjacent hills are not held. It looks a mad enterprise on paper, but Stum knows that it is possible enough. The question is, will the Russians guess that? I say no, not unless someone tells them. Therefore, by hook or by crook, we've got to get that information through to them." Sandy's interest in ordinary things was beginning to flicker up again. He studied the map and began to measure distances. "Peter's going to have a try for it. He thinks there's a sporting chance of his getting through the lines. If he does, if he gets this map to the Grand Duke's staff, then Stum's goose is cooked. In 3 days the Cossacks will be in the streets of Erzurum." "What are the chances?" Sandy asked. I glanced at Peter. "We're hard-bitten fellows, and can face the truth. I think the chances against success are about 5 to 1. 2 to 1, said Peter modestly. "Not worse than that. I don't think you're fair to me, Dick, my old friend." I looked at that lean, tight figure and the gentle, resolute face, and I changed my mind. "I'm hanged if I think there are any odds," I said. "With anybody else it would want a miracle, but with Peter I believe the chances are level." 2 to 1, Peter persisted. "If it was evens I wouldn't be interested." "Let me go," Sandy cried. "I talk the lingo, and can pass as a Turk, and I'm a million times likelier to get through. For God's sake, Dick, let me go." "Not you. You're wanted here. If you disappear the whole show's busted too soon, and the 3 of us left behind will be strung up before morning. No, my son, you're going to escape, but it will be in company with Blenkerin and me. We've got to blow the whole Greenmantle business so high that the bits of it will never come to earth again. First, tell me how many of your fellows will stick by you. I mean the companions. The whole half-dozen. They are very worried already about what has happened. She made me sound them in her presence, and they were quite ready to accept me as Greenmantle's successor. But they have their suspicions about what happened at the villa, and they've no love for the woman. They'd follow me through hell if I bade them, but they would rather it was my own show." "That's all right," I cried. "It is the one thing I've been doubtful about. Now observe this map. Erzurum isn't invested by a long chalk. The Russians are round it in a broad half-moon. That means that all the west, south-west, and north-west is open and undefended by trench lines. There are flanks far away to the north and south in the hills which can be turned, and once we get round a flank there's nothing between us and our friends. I've figured out our road, and I traced it on the map. If we can make that big circuit to the west and get over that pass unobserved, we're bound to strike a Russian column the next day. It'll be a rough road, but I fancy we've all ridden as bad in our time. But one thing we must have, and that's horses. Can we and your 6 ruffians slip off in the darkness on the best beasts in this township? If you can manage that, we'll do the trick." Sandy sat down and pondered. Thank heaven, he was thinking now of action and not of his own conscience. "It must be done," he said at last, "but it won't be easy. Hudson's a great fellow, but as you know well, Dick, horses right up at the battle front are not easy to come by. Tomorrow I've got some kind of infernal fast to observe, and the next day that woman will be coaching me for my part. We'll have to give Hudson time. I wish to heaven it could be tonight." He was silent again for a bit, and then he said, "I believe the best time would be the 3rd night, the eve of the revelation. She's bound to leave me alone that night." "Righto," I said. "It won't be much fun sitting waiting in this cold sepulchre, but we must keep our heads and risk nothing by being in a hurry. Besides, if Peter wins through, the Turk will be a busy man by the day after tomorrow." The key turned in the door, and Hudson stole in like a shade. It was the signal for Sandy to leave. "You fellows have given me a new lease of life," he said. "I've got a plan now, and I can set my teeth and stick it out." He went up to Peter and gripped his hand. "Good luck. You're the bravest man I've ever met, and I've seen a few." Then he turned abruptly and went out, followed by an exhortation from Blenkiron to get busy about the quadrupeds. Then we set about equipping Peter for his crusade. It was a simple job, for we were not rich in properties. His get-up, with his thick fur-collared greatcoat, was unlike the ordinary Turkish officer seen in a dim light. But Peter had no intention of passing for a Turk, or indeed of giving anybody the chance of seeing him, and he was more concerned to fit in with the landscape. So he stripped off the greatcoat and pulled a grey sweater of mine over his jacket, and put on his head a woolen helmet of the same colour. He had no need of the map, for he had long since got his route by heart, and what was once fixed in that mind stuck like wax. But I made him take Stumm's plan and paper, hidden below his shirt. The big difficulty, I saw, would be getting to the Russians without getting shot, assuming he passed the Turkish trenches. He could only hope that he would strike someone with a smattering of English or German. Twice he ascended to the roof and came back cheerful, for there was promise of wild weather. Husband brought in our supper, and Peter made up a parcel of food. Blenheim and I had both small flasks of brandy, and I gave him mine. Then he held out his hand quite simply, like a good child who is going off to bed. It was too much for Blenheim. With large tears rolling down his face, he announced that, if we all came through, he was going to fit him into the softest berth that money could buy. I don't think he was understood, for old Peter's eyes had now the faraway absorption of the hunter who has found game. He was thinking only of his job. 2 legs and a pair of very shabby boots vanished through the trap, and suddenly I felt utterly lonely and desperately sad. The guns were beginning to roar again in the east, and in the intervals came the whistle of the rising storm.
Chapter 20. Peter Pinar Goes to the Wars. This chapter is the tale that Peter told me long after, sitting beside a stove in the hotel at Bergen, where we were waiting for our boat. He climbed on the roof and shinned down the broken bricks of the outer wall. The outbuilding we were lodged in abutted on a road. It was outside the proper enceinte of the house. At ordinary times, I have no doubt there were sentries, but Sandy and Husson had probably managed to clear them off this end for a little. Anyhow, he saw nobody as he crossed the road and dived into the snowy fields. He knew very well that he must do the job in the 12 hours of darkness ahead of him. The immediate front of the battle is a bit too public for anyone to lie hidden in by day, especially when 2 or 3 feet of snow make everything can-speckle. Now, hurry in a job of this kind was abhorrent to Peter's soul, for, like all Boers, his tastes were for slowness and sureness, though he could hustle fast enough when haste was needed. As he pushed through the winter fields, he reckoned up the things in his favor, and found the only one, the dirty weather. There was a high, gusty wind, blowing scuds of snow, but never coming to any great fall. The frost had gone, but the lying snow was as soft as butter. That was all to the good, he thought, for a clear, hard night would have been the devil. The first bit was through farmlands, which were seamed with little snow-filled water furrows. Now and then would come a house and a patch of fruit trees, but there was nobody abroad. The roads were crowded enough, but Peter had no use for roads. I can picture him swinging along with his bent back, stopping every now and then to sniff and listen, alert for the foreknowledge of danger. When he chose, he could cover a country like an antelope. Soon he struck a big road full of transport. It was the road from Erzurum to the Palantuken Pass, and he waited his chance and crossed it. After that, the ground grew rough with boulders and patches of thorn trees, splendid cover where he could move fast without worrying. Then he was pulled up suddenly on the bank of a river. The map had warned him of it, but not that it would be so big. It was a torrent, swollen with melting snow and rains in the hills, and it was running 50 yards wide. Peter thought he could have swum it, and he was very adverse to a drenching. A wet man makes too much noise, he said, and besides, there was the off chance that the current would be too much for him. So he moved upstream to look for a bridge. In 10 minutes he found one, a new-made thing of trestles, broad enough to take transport wagons. It was guarded, for he heard the tramp of a sentry, and as he pulled himself up the bank he observed a couple of long wooden huts, obviously some kind of billets. These were on the near side of the stream, about a dozen yards from the bridge. A door stood open and a light showed in it. From within came the sound of voices. Peter had a sense of hearing like a wild animal, and he could detect even from the confused gabble that the voices were German. As he lay and listened, someone came over the bridge. It was an officer, for the sentry saluted. The man disappeared in one of the huts. Peter had struck the billets and repairing shop of a squad of German sappers. He was just going ruefully to retrace his steps and try to find a good place to swim the stream when it struck him that the officer who had just passed him wore clothes very like his own. He, too, had a grey sweater and a baklava helmet, for even a German officer ceases to be dressy on a midwinter's night in Anatolia. The idea came to Peter to walk boldly across the bridge and trust to the sentry, not seeing the difference. He slipped around a corner of the hut and marched down the road. The sentry was now at the far end, which was lucky, for if the worst came to the worst, he could throttle him. Peter, mimicking the stiff German walk, swung past him, his head down as if to protect him from the wind. The man saluted. He did more, for he offered conversation. The officer must have been a genial soul. "It's a rough night, Captain," he said in German. "The wagons are late. Pray God Michael hasn't got a shell in his lot. They've begun putting over some big ones." Peter grunted good night in German and strode on. He was just leaving the road when he heard a great halloo behind him. The real officer must have appeared on his heels, and the sentry's doubts had been stirred. A whistle was blown, and, looking back, Peter saw lanterns waving in the gale. They were coming out to look for the duplicate. He stood still for a second, and noticed the lights spreading out south of the road. He was just about to dive off it on the north side, when he was aware of a difficulty. On that side a steep bank fell to a ditch, and the bank beyond bounded a big flood. He could see the dull ruffle of the water under the wind. On the road itself he would soon be caught. South of it the search was beginning, and the ditch itself offered no place to hide, for he saw a lantern moving up it. Peter dropped into it all the same and made a plan. The side below the road was a little undercut and very steep. He resolved to plaster himself against it, for he would be hidden from the road, and a searcher in the ditch would not be likely to explore the unbroken sides. It was always a maxim of Peter's that the best hiding place was the worst, at least obvious to the minds of those who were looking for you. He waited until the lights both in the road and the ditch came nearer, and then he gripped the edge with his left hand where some stones gave him purchase, dug the toes of his boots into the wet soil, and stuck like a limpet. It needed some strength to keep that position for long, but the muscles of his arms and legs were like whipcord. The searcher in the ditch soon got tired, for the place was very wet, and joined his comrades on the road. They came along, running, flashing the lanterns into the trench and exploring all the immediate countryside. Then rose a noise of wheels and horses from the opposite direction. Michael and the delayed wagons were approaching. They dashed up at a great pace, driven wildly, and for one horrid second Peter thought they were going to spill into the ditch at the very spot where he was concealed. The wheels passed so close to the edge that they almost grazed his fingers. Somebody shouted an order, and they pulled up a yard or two nearer the bridge. The others came up, and there was a consultation. Michael swore he had passed no one on the road. "That fool Hannes has seen a ghost," said the officer testily. "It's too cold for this child's play." Hannes, almost in tears, repeated his tale. "The man spoke to me in good German," he cried. "Ghost or no ghost, he is safe enough up the road," said the officer. "Please God, that was a big one." He stopped and stared at a shell burst, for the bombardment from the east was growing fiercer. They stood discussing the fire for a minute, and presently moved off. Peter gave them 2 minutes' law, then clambered back to the highway and set off along it at a run. The noise of the shelling and the wind, together with the thick darkness, made it safe to hurry. He left the road at the first chance and took to the broken country. The ground was now rising towards the spur of the Palantuken, on a far slope of which were the Turkish trenches. The night had begun by being pretty nearly as black as pitch. Even the smoke from the shell explosions, which was often visible in darkness, could not be seen. But as the wind blew the snow clouds athwart, the sky patches of stars came out. Peter had a compass, but he didn't need to use it, for he had a kind of feel for landscape, a special sense which is born in savages, and can only be acquired after long experience by the white man. I believe he could smell where the north lay. He had settled roughly which part of the line he would try, merely because of its nearness to the enemy. But he might see reason to vary this. As he moved, he began to think that the safest place was where the shelling was hottest. He didn't like the notion, but it sounded sense. Suddenly he began to puzzle over queer things in the ground, and, as if he had never seen big guns before, it took him a moment to fix them. Presently one went off at his elbow with a roar like the last day. These were Austrian howitzers, nothing over 8-inch, I fancy, but to Peter they looked like leviathans. Here, too, he saw for the first time a big and quite recent shell hole, for the Russian guns were searching out the position. He was so interested in it all that he poked his nose where he shouldn't have been, and dropped plumb into the pit behind a gun encampment. Gunners all over the world are the same. Shy people who hide themselves in holes, and hibernate and mortally dislike being detected. A gruff voice cried, "Verda?" and a heavy hand seized his neck. Peter was ready with his story. He belonged to Michael's wagon team and had been left behind. He wanted to be told the way to the sappers' camp. He was very apologetic, not to say obsequious. "It is one of those Prussian finds from the Marta Bridge," said a gunner. "Bend him a kick to teach him sense. Bear to your right, Lamkin, and you will find a road. And have a care when you get there, for the Ruskos are registering on it." Peter thanked them and bore off to the right. After that he kept a wary eye on the howitzers, and was thankful when he got out of their area to the slopes up the hill. And he defied any Turk or Boche to spot him among the scrub and boulders. He was getting on very well, when once more, close to his ear, came a sound like the crack of doom. It was the field guns now, and the sound of a field gun close at hand is bad for the nerves if you aren't expecting it. Peter thought he had been hit, and lay flat for a little to consider. Then he found the right explanation, and crawled forward very warily. Presently he saw his first Russian shell. It dropped 6 yards to his right, making a great hole in the snow and sending up a mass of mixed earth, snow, and broken stones. Peter spat out the dirt and felt very solemn. You must remember that never in his life had he seen big shelling, and was now being landed in the thick of a first-class show without any preparation. He said he felt cold in his stomach, and very wishful to run away, if there had been anywhere to run. But he kept on to the crest of the ridge, over which a big glow was broadening like sunrise. He tripped once over a wire which he took for some kind of snare, and after that went very warily. By and by he got his face between 2 boulders and looked over into the true battlefield. He told me it was exactly what the predicant used to say that hell would be like. About 50 yards down the slope lay the Turkish trenches. They were dark against the snow, and now and then a black figure like a devil showed for an instant and disappeared. The Turks clearly expected an infantry attack, for they were sending up calcium rockets and very flares. The Russians were battering their line and spraying all the hinterland, not with shrapnel, but with good, solid, high explosives. The place would be as bright as day for a moment, all smothered in a scurry of smoke and snow and debris, and then a black pall would fall on it, when only the thunder of the guns told of the battle. Peter felt very sick. He had not believed there could be so much noise in the world, and the drums of his ears were splitting. Now, for a man whom courage is habitual, the taste of fear, naked, utter fear, is a horrible thing. It seems to wash away all his manhood. Peter lay on the crest, watching the shells burst, and confident that any moment he might be a shattered remnant. He lay and reasoned with himself, calling himself every name he could think of, but conscious that nothing would get rid of that lump of ice below his heart. Then he could stand it no longer. He got up and ran for his life. But he ran forward. It was the craziest performance. He went hell for leather over a piece of ground which was being watered with HE, but by the mercy of heaven nothing hit him. He took some fearful tosses in shell holes. Partly erect and partly on all fours, he did the 50 yards and tumbled into a Turkish trench right on top of a dead man. The contact with that body brought him to his senses. That man could die at all seemed a comforting, homely thing after that unnatural pandemonium. The next moment a crump took the parapet of the trench some yards to his left, and he was half buried in an avalanche. He crawled out of that, pretty badly cut about the head. He was quite cool now and thinking hard about his next step. There were men all around him, sullen, dark faces as he saw them when the flares went up. They were manning the parapets and waiting tensely for something else than the shelling. They paid no attention to him, for I fancy that in the trench units are pretty well mixed up, and under a bad bombardment no one bothers about his neighbour. He found himself free to move as he pleased. The ground of the trench was littered with empty cartridge cases, and there were many dead bodies. The last shell, as I have said, had played havoc with the parapet. In the next spell of darkness Peter crawled through the gap and twisted among some snowy hillocks. He was no longer afraid of shells, any more than he was afraid of a veld thunderstorm, but he was wondering very hard how he should ever get to the Russians. The Turks were behind him now, but there was the biggest danger in front. Then the artillery ceased. It was so sudden that he thought he had gone deaf, and could hardly realize the blessed relief of it. The wind, too, seemed to have fallen, or perhaps he was sheltered by the lee of the hill. There were a lot of dead here, also, and that he couldn't understand, for they were new dead. Had the Turks attacked and been driven back? When he had gone about 30 yards, he stopped to take his bearings. On the right were the ruins of a large building set on fire by guns. There was a blur of woods and the debris of walls round it. Away to the left another hill ran out farther to the east, and the place he was in seemed to be a kind of cup between the spurs. Just before him was a little ruined building, with the sky seen through its rafters, for the smouldering ruin on the right gave a certain light. He wondered if the Russian firing line lay there. Just then he heard voices, smothered voices, not a yard away and apparently below the ground. He instantly jumped to what this must mean. It was a Turkish trench, a communication trench. Peter didn't know much about modern warfare, but he had read in the papers, or heard from me, enough to make him draw the right moral. The fresh dead pointed to the same conclusion. What he had got through were the Turkish support trenches, not their firing line. That was still before him. He didn't despair, for the reef bound from panic had made him extra courageous. He crawled forward, an inch at a time, taking no sort of risk, and presently found himself looking at the perilous of a trench. Then he lay quiet to think out the next step. The shelling had stopped, and there was that queer kind of peace which falls sometimes on two armies not a quarter of a mile distant. Peter said he could hear nothing but the far-off sighing of the wind. There seemed to be no movement of any kind in the trench before him, which ran through the ruined building. The light of the burning was dying, and he could just make out a mound of earth a yard in front. He got out his packet of food and had a swig at the brandy flask. That comforted him, and he felt the master of his fate again. But the next step was not so easy. He must find out what lay behind that mound of earth. Suddenly a curious sound fell on his ears. It was so faint that at first he doubted the evidence of his senses. Then, as the wind fell, it came louder. It was exactly like some hollow piece of metal being struck by a stick, musical and oddly resonant. He concluded it was the wind blowing a branch of a tree against an old boiler in the room before him. The trouble was that there was scarcely enough wind now for that in this sheltered cup. But as he listened he caught the note again. It was a bell, a fallen bell, and the place before him must have been a chapel. He remembered that an Armenian monastery had been marked on the big map, and he guessed it was the burned building to his right. The thought of a chapel and a bell gave him the notion of some human agency, and then suddenly the notion was confirmed. The sound was regular and concerted. Dot, dash, dot, dash, dot, dot. The branch of a tree and the wind may play strange pranks, but they do not produce the longs and shorts of the Morse code. This was where Peter's intelligence work in the Boer War helped him. He knew the Morse, he could read it, but he could make nothing of the signaling. It was either in some special code or in a strange language. He lay still and did some calm thinking. There was a man in front of him, a Turkish soldier, who was in the enemy's pay. Therefore he could fraternize with him, for they were on the same side. But how was he to approach him without getting shot in the process? Again, How could a man send signals to the army from a firing line without being detected? Peter found an answer in the strange configuration of the ground. He had not heard a sound until he was a few yards from the place, and they would be inaudible to men in the reserve trenches and even in the communication trenches. If somebody moving up the ladder caught the noise, it would be easy to explain it naturally, but the wind blowing down the cup would carry it far in the enemy's direction. There remained the risk of being heard by those parallel with the bell in the firing trenches. Peter concluded that the trench must be very thinly held, probably only by a few observers, and the nearest might be a dozen yards off. He had read about that being the French fashion under a big bombardment. The next thing was to find out how to make himself known to his ally. He decided that the only way was to surprise him. He might get shot, but he trusted to his strength and agility against a man who was almost certainly wearied. When he had got him safe, explanations might follow. Peter was now enjoying himself hugely. If only these infernal guns kept silent, he would play out the game in the sobered, decorous way he loved. So very delicately he began to wriggle forward to where the sound was. The night was now as black as ink round him, and very quiet too, except for the sawings of the dying gale. Snow had drifted a little in the lee of the ruined walls, and Peter's progress was naturally very slow. He could not afford to dislodge 1 ounce of snow. Still the tinkling went on, now in greater volume. Peter was in terror lest it should cease before he got his man. Presently his hand clutched at empty space. He was on the lip of the front trench. The sound was now a yard to his right, and with infinite care he shifted his position. Now the bell was just below him, and he felt the big rafter of the woodwork from which it had fallen. He felt something else, a stretch of wire fixed in the ground with the far end hanging in the void. That would be the spy's explanation if anyone heard the sound and came seeking the cause. Somewhere in the darkness before him and below was the man, not a yard off. Peter remained very still, studying the situation. He could not see, but he could feel the presence, and he was trying to decide the relative position of the man and bell and their exact distance from him. The thing was not so easy as it looked, for if he jumped for where he believed the figure was, he might miss it and get a bullet in the stomach. A man who played so risky a game was probably handy with his firearms. Besides, if he should hit the bell, he would make a hideous row and alarm the whole front. Fate suddenly gave him the right chance. The unseen figure stood up and moved a step, until his back was against the parados. He actually brushed against Peter's elbow, who held his breath. There is a catch that the Kaffirs have, which would need several diagrams to explain. It is partly a neck hold and partly a paralyzing backward twist of the right arm, but if it is practiced on a man from behind, it locks him as short as if he were handcuffed. Peter slowly got his body raised and his knees under him, and reached for his prey. He got him. A head was pulled backward over the edge of the trench, and he felt in the air the motion of the left arm pawing feebly but unable to reach behind. "Be still," whispered Peter in German. "I mean you no harm. We are friends with the same purpose. Do you speak German?" "Nein," said a muffled voice. "English?" "Yes," said the voice. "Thank God," said Peter, "that we can understand each other. I have watched your notion of signaling, and a very good one it is. I've got to get through the Russian lines somehow before morning, and I want you to help me. I'm English, a kind of English, so we're on the same side. If I let go your neck, will you be good and talk reasonably?" The voice assented. Peter let go, and in the same instant slipped to the side. The man wheeled around and flung out an arm, but gripped vacancy. "Steady, friend," said Peter. "You mustn't play tricks on me, or I'll be angry." "Who are you? Who sent you?" asked a puzzled voice. Peter hid a happy thought. "The companions of the rosy hours," he said. "Then we are friends indeed," said the voice. "Come out of the darkness, friend, and I will do you no harm. I am a good Turk, and I fought beside the English in Kordofan, and learned their language. I live only to see the ruin of the Enver, who has beggared my family and slain my twin brother. Therefore I serve the Muskov Jars. I don't know what the musky jaws are, but if you mean the Russians, I'm with you. I've got news for them which would make Enver green. The question is, how I'm to get to them, and that is where you shall help me, my friend." "How?" "By playing that little tune of yours again. Tell them to expect within the next half-hour a deserter with an important message. Tell them, for God's sake, not to fire at anyone until they've made certain it isn't me." The man took the blunt end of his bayonet and squatted beside the bell. The first stroke brought out a clear, searching note which floated down the valley. He struck 3 notes at slow intervals. For all the world, Peter said, he was like a telegraph operator calling up a station. "Send the message in English," said Peter. "They may not understand it," said the man. "Then send it any way you like. I trust you, for we are brothers." After 10 minutes the man ceased and listened. From far away came the sound of a trench gong, the kind of thing they used on the Western Front to give the gas alarm. "They say they will be ready," he said. "I cannot take down messages in the darkness, but they have given me the signal which means consent." "Come, that is pretty good," said Peter. "And now I must be moving. You take a hint from me. When you hear big firing up to the north, get ready to beat a quick retreat, for it will all be up with that city of yours. And tell your folk, too, that they're making a bad mistake letting those fool Germans rule their land. Let them hang Enver and his little friends, and we'll be happy once more." "May Satan receive his soul," said the Turk. "There is wire before us, but I will show you a way through. The guns this evening made many rents in it. But haste, for a working party may be here presently to repair it. Remember, there is much wire before the other lines." Peter, with certain directions, found it pretty easy to make his way through the entanglement. There was one bit which scraped a hole in his back, but very soon he had come to the last post and found himself in open country. The place, he said, was a graveyard among unburied dead that smelt horribly as he crawled among them. He had no inducements to delay, for he thought he could hear behind him the movement of the Turkish working party, and was in terror that a flare might reveal him and a volley accompany his retreat. From one shell hole to another he wormed his way, until he struck an old ruinous communication trench which led in the right direction. The Turks must have been forced back in the past week, and the Russians were now in the evacuated trenches. The thing was half full of water, but it gave Peter a feeling of safety, for it enabled him to get his head below the level of the ground. Then it came to an end, and he found before him a forest of wire. The Turk in his signal had mentioned half an hour, but Peter thought it was near 2 hours before he got through that noxious entanglement. Shelling had made little difference to it. The uprights were all there, and the barbed strands seemed to touch the ground. Remember, he had no wire cutter, nothing but his bare hands. Once again, fear got hold of him. He felt caught in a net, with monstrous vultures waiting to pounce on him from above. At any moment a flare might go up, and a dozen rifles find their mark. He had altogether forgotten about the message which had been sent, for no message could dissuade the ever-present death he felt around him. It was, he said, like following an old lion into bush, when there was but one narrow way in and no road out. The guns began again, the Turkish guns, from behind the ridge, and a shell tore up the wire a short way before him. Under cover of the burst he made a few good yards, leaving large portions of his clothing in the strands. Then, quite suddenly, when hope had almost died in his heart, he felt the ground rise steeply. He lay very still. A star rocket from the Turkish side lit up the place, and there in front was a rampart with the points of bayonets showing beyond it. It was the Russian hour for stand to. He raised his cramped limbs from the ground, shouted, "Friend! English!" A face looked down at him, and then the darkness again descended. "Friend!" he said hoarsely. "English!" He heard speech beyond the parapet. An electric torch was flashed on him for a second. A voice spoke, a friendly voice, and the sound of it seemed to be telling him to come over. He was standing now, and as he got his hands on the parapet, he seemed to feel the bayonets very near him. But the voice that spoke was kindly, so with a heave he scrambled over and flopped into the trench. Once more the electric torch was flashed, and revealed to the eyes of the onlookers an indescribably dirty, lean, middle-aged man with a bloody head and scarcely a rag of shirt on his back. The said man, seeing friendly faces around him, grinned cheerfully. "That was a rough trek, friends," he said. I want to see your general pretty quick, for I've got a present for him." He was taken to an officer in a dugout, who addressed him in French, which he did not understand, but the sight of Sturm's plan worked wonders. After that he was fairly bundled down communication trenches, and then over swampy fields to a farm among trees. There he found staff officers, who looked at him and looked at his map, and then put him on a horse and hurried him eastwards. At last he came to a big ruined house, and was taken into a room which seemed full of maps and generals. The conclusion must be told in Peter's words. "There was a big man sitting at a table drinking coffee, and when I saw him my heart jumped out of my skin, for it was the man I had hunted with on the Pungva in '98, him whom the Kafirs called Buck's Horn because of his long curled moustaches. He was a prince even then, and now he is a very great general. When I saw him I ran forward and gripped his hand and cried, 'How got het me here?' And he knew me and shouted in Dutch, 'Damn if it isn't old Peter Pienaar!' Then he gave me coffee and ham and good bread, and he looked at my map. 'What is this?' he cried, growing red in the face. 'It is the staff map of one Sturm, a German skellum who commands in yon city,' I said. He looked at it close and read the markings, and then he read the other paper which you gave me, Vic. And then he flung up his arms and laughed. He took a loaf and tossed it into the air so that it fell on the head of another general. He spoke to them in their own tongue, and they too laughed, and one or two ran out as if on some errand. I have never seen such merrymaking. They were clever men, and they knew the worth of what you gave me. Then he got to his feet and hugged me, all dirty as I was, and kissed me on both cheeks. 'Before God, Peter, you are the mightiest hunter since Nimrod. You found me game, but never game so big as this.'"
Chapter 21. The Little Hill. It was a wise man who said that the biggest kind of courage was to be able to sit still. I used to feel that when we were getting shelled in the reserve trenches outside Ramai. I felt it before we went over the parapets at Los, but I never felt it so much as on the last 2 days in that cellar. I had simply to set my teeth and take a pull on myself. Peter had gone on a crazy errand which I scarcely believed could come off. There were no signs of Sandy. Somewhere, within 100 yards, he was fighting his own battles, and I was tormented by the thought that he might get jumpy again and wreck everything. A strange companion brought us food, a man who only spoke Turkish and could tell us nothing. Hussein, I judged, was very busy about the horses. If I could only have done something to help on matters, I could have scotched my anxiety. But there was nothing to be done, nothing but wait and brood. I tell you, I began to sympathize with the general behind the lines in a battle, the fellow who makes the plan which others execute. Leading a charge can be nothing like so nerve-shaking a business as sitting in an easy-chair and waiting on the news of it. It was bitter cold, and we spent most of the day wrapped in our greatcoats and buried deep in the straw. Blenkiron was a marvel. There was no light for him to play patience by, but he never complained. He slept a lot of the time, and when he was awake, talked as cheerily as if he were starting out on a holiday. He had one great comfort. His dyspepsia was gone. He sang hymns constantly to the benign providence that had squared his duodenum. My only occupation was to listen for the guns. At first, after Peter left, they were very quiet on the front nearest us, but in the late evening they started a terrific racket. The next day they never stopped from dawn to dusk, so that it reminded me of that tremendous 48 hours before Laos. I tried to read into this some proof that Peter had got through, but it would not work. It looked more like the opposite, for this desperate hammering must mean that the frontal assault was still the Russian game. 2 or 3 times I climbed on the housetop for fresh air. The day was foggy and damp, and I could see very little of the countryside. Transport was still bumping southward along the road to the Palantuken, and the slow wagon loads of wounded returning. One thing I noticed, however, there was a perpetual coming and going between the houses and the city. Motors and mounted messengers were constantly arriving and departing, and I concluded that Hilda von Einem was getting ready for her part in the defence of Erzurum. These ascents were all on the first day after Peter's going. The second day, when I tried the trap, I found it closed and heavily weighted. This must have been done by our friends, and very right, too. If the house were becoming a place of public resort, it would never do for me to be journeying roofward. Late on the second night, Husin reappeared. It was after supper, when Blenkiron had gone peacefully to sleep, and I was beginning to count the hours till the morning. I could not close an eye during those days, and not much at night. Husin did not light a lantern. I heard his key in the lock, and then his light step close to where we lay. "Are you asleep?" he said, and when I answered he sat down beside me. "The horses are found," he said, "and the master bids me tell you that we start in the morning 3 hours before dawn." It was welcome news. "Tell me what happened," I begged. "We've been lying in this tomb for 3 days and heard nothing." "The guns are busy," he said. "The elements come to this place every hour, I know not for what. Also there has been a great search for you. The searchers have been here, but they were sent away empty. Sleep, my lord, for there is wild work before us." I did not sleep much, for I was strung too high with expectation, and I envied Blenkiron his now eupeptic slumbers. But for an hour or so I dropped off, and my old nightmare came back. Once again I was in the throat of a pass, hotly pursued, straining for some sanctuary which I knew I must reach. But I was no longer alone. Others were with me. How many I could not tell, for when I tried to see their faces they dissolved in mist. Deep snow was underfoot. A grey sky was over us. Black peaks were on all sides, but ahead in the mist of the pass was that curious cathedral which I had first seen in my dream on the Erzurum road. I saw it distinct in every detail. It rose to the left of the road, through the pass, above a hollow where great boulders stood out in the snow. Its sides were steep, so that the snow had slipped off in patches, leaving stretches of glistening black shale. The crans at the top did not rise sheer, but sloped at an angle of 45, and on the very summit there seemed a hollow, as if the earth within the rock rim had been beaten by weather into a cup. That is often the way with the South African cathedral, and I knew it was so with this. We were straining for it, but the snow clogged us, and our enemies were very close behind. Then I was awakened by a figure at my side. "Get ready, my lord," it said. "It is the hour to ride." Like sleepwalkers, we moved into the sharp air. Husin led us out of an old postern, and then through a place like an orchard to the shelter of some tall evergreen trees. There horses stood, champing quietly from their nosebags. Good, I thought, a feed of oats before a big effort. There were 9 beasts for 9 riders. We mounted without a word and filed through a grove of trees to where a broken paling marked the beginning of cultivated land. There, for the matter of 20 minutes, Husin chose to guide us through deep, clogging snow. He wanted to avoid any sound till we were well beyond earshot of the house. Then we struck a bypath which presently emerged on a hard highway, running, as I judged, southwest by west. There we delayed no longer, but galloped furiously into the dark. I had got back all my exhilaration. Indeed, I was intoxicated with the movement, and I could have laughed out loud and sung. Under the black canopy of the night, perils were either forgotten or terribly alive. Mine were forgotten. The darkness I galloped into led me to freedom and friends. Yes, and success, which I had not dared to hope, and scarcely even to dream of. Husin rode first, with me at his side. I turned my head and saw Blenkiron behind me, evidently mortally unhappy about the pace we had set in the mount he sat. He used to say that horse exercise was good for his liver, but it was a gentle amble and a short gallop that he liked, not this mad helter-skelter. His thighs were too round to fit a saddle leather. We passed a fire in the hollow, the bivouac of some Turkish unit, and all the horses shied violently. I knew by Blenkiron's oaths that he had lost his stirrups and was sitting on his horse's neck. Beside him rode a tall figure, swathed to the eyes in wrappings, and wearing round his neck some kind of shawl whose ends floated behind him. Sandy, of course, had no European ulster, for it was months since he had worn proper clothes. I wanted to speak to him, but somehow I did not dare. His stillness forbade me. He was a wonderful fine horseman, with his firm English hunting seat, and it was as well, for he paid no attention to his beast. His head was still full of unquiet thoughts. Then the air around me began to smell acrid and raw, and I saw that a fog was winding up from the hollows. "Here's the devil's own luck," I cried to Husan. "Can you guide us in a mist?" "I do not know." He shook his head. "I had counted on seeing the shape of the hills. We've a map and a compass anyhow, but these make slow travelling. Pray God it lifts." Presently the black vapour changed to grey, and the day broke. It was little comfort. The fog rolled in waves to the horses' ears, and riding at the head of the party, I could but dimly see the next rank. "It is time to leave the road," said Husan, "or we may meet inquisitive folk." We struck to the left, over ground which for all the world was like a Scotch moor. There were pools of rain on it, and masses of tangled snow-laden junipers, and long reefs of wet slaty stone. It was bad going, and the fog made it hopeless to steer with a good course. I had out the map and the compass, and tried to fix our route so as to round the flank of a spur of the mountains which separated us from the valley we were aiming at. "There's a stream ahead of us," I said to Husan. "Is it fordable?" "It is only a trickle," he said, coughing. "This cursed mist is from Eblis." But I knew long before we reached it that it was no trickle. It was a hill stream coming down in spate, and, as I soon guessed, in a deep ravine. Presently we were at its edge, one long whirl of yeasty falls and brown rapids. We could as soon get the horses over it as to the topmost cliffs of the Palantuken. Husan stared at it in consternation. "May Allah forgive my folly, for I should have known. We must return to the highway and find a bridge. My sorrow, for I should have led my lord so ill." Back over the moor we went, with my spirits badly damped. We had none too long a start, and Hilda von Eidem would rouse heaven and earth to catch us up. Husan was forcing the pace, for his anxiety was as great as mine. Before we reached the road, the mist blew back and revealed a wedge of country right across to the hills beyond the river. It was a clear view, every object standing out wet and sharp in the light of morning. It showed the bridge with horsemen drawn up across it, and it showed, too, cavalry pickets moving along the road. They saw us at the same instant. A word was passed down the road, a shrill whistle blew, and the pickets put their horses at the bank and started across the moor. "Did I not say this mist was from Eblis?" growled Husan, as we swung round and galloped back in our tracks. "These cursed Zapatas have seen us, and our road is cut." I was for trying the stream at all costs, but Husan pointed out that it would do us no good, that the cavalry beyond the bridge was moving up the other bank. "There is a path through the woods that I know, but it must be travelled on foot. If we can increase our lead, and the mist cloaks us, there's yet a chance." It was a weary business plodding up into the skirts of the hills. We had the pursuit behind us now, and that put an edge on every difficulty. There were long banks of broken screes, I remember, where the snow slipped in wreaths from under our feet. Great boulders had to be circumvented, and patches of bog where the streams from the snows first made contact with the plains mired us to our girth. Happily the mist was down again, but this, though it hindered the chase, lessened the chances of Husan finding the path. He found it, nevertheless. There was the gully and the rough mule track leading upwards. But there also had been a landslip, quite recent from the marks. A large scar of earth had broken across the hillside, which, with the snow above it, looked like a slice cut out of an iced chocolate cake. We stared blankly for a second, till we recognized its hopelessness. "I'm trying for the crags," I said. "Where there once was a way, another can be found." "And be picked off at their leisure by these marksmen," said Husan grimly. "Look!" The mist had opened again, and a glance behind showed me the pursuit closing up on us. They were now less than 300 yards off. We turned our horses and made off eastward along the skirts of the cliff. Then Sandy spoke for the first time. "I don't know how you fellows feel, but I'm not going to be taken. There's nothing much to do except find a place and put up a fight. We can sell our lives dearly." "That's about all," said Blenkiron cheerfully. He suffered such tortures on that gallop that he welcomed any kind of stationary fight. "Serve out the arms," said Sandy. The companions all carried rifles slung across their shoulders. Husin, from a deep saddlebag, brought out rifles and bandoliers for the rest of us. As I lay mine across my saddlebow, I saw it was a German Mauser of the latest pattern. "It's hell for leather till we find a place for a stand," said Sandy. "The game's against us this time." Once more we entered the mist, and presently found better going on a long stretch of even slope. Then came a rise, and on the crest of it I saw the sun. Presently we dipped into bright daylight and looked down on a broad glen with a road winding up it to a pass in the range. I had expected this. It was one way to the Palantuken Pass, some miles south of the house where we had been lodged. And then, as I looked southward, I saw what I had been watching for days. A little hill split the valley, and on its top was a krantz of rocks. It was the Castro of my persistent dream. On that I promptly took charge. "There's our fort," I cried. "If we once get there, we can hold it for a week. Sit down and ride for it." We bucketed down that hillside like men possessed, even Blank-Iron sticking on manfully among the twists and turns and slithers. Presently we were on the road and were racing past marching infantry and gun teams and empty wagons. I noted that most seemed to be moving downward and a few going up. Husin screamed some words in Turkish that secured us a passage, but indeed our crazy speed left them staring. Out of a corner of my eye I saw that Sandy had flung off most of his wrappings and seemed to be all a-dazzle of rich color. But I had thought for nothing except the little hill, now almost fronting us across the shallow glen. No horses could breast that steep. We urged them into the hollow, then hastily dismounted, humped the packs, and began to struggle up the side of the Castro. It was strewn with great boulders, which gave a kind of cover that very soon was needed. For, snatching a glance back, I saw that our pursuers were on the road above us and were getting ready to shoot. At normal times we would have been easy marks, but, fortunately, wisps and streamers of mist now clung about that hollow. The rest could fend for themselves, so I stuck to Blank-Iron and dragged him, wholly breathless, by the least exposed road. Bullets spattered now and then against the rocks, and one sang unpleasantly near my head. In this way we covered 3/4 of the distance, and had only the bare dozen yards where the gradient eased off up to the edge of the krantz. Blank-Iron got hit in the leg, our only casualty. There was nothing for it but to carry him, so I swung him on my shoulders, and with the bursting heart did that last lap. It was hottish work, and the bullets were pretty thick about us, but we all got safely to the krantz, and a short scramble took us over the edge. I laid Blank-Iron inside the Castro, and started to prepare our defense. We had little time to do it. Out of the thin fog figures were coming, crouching in cover. The place we were in was a natural redoubt, except that there were no loopholes or sandbags. We had to show our heads over the rim to shoot, but the danger was lessened by the superb field of fire given by those last dozen yards of glacis. I posted the men and waited, and Blank-Iron, with a white face, insisted on taking his share, announcing that he used to be handy with a gun. I gave the order that no man was to shoot till the enemy had come out of the rocks to the top of the glacis. The thing ran right round the top, and we had to watch all sides to prevent them getting us in flank or rear. Husin's rifle cracked out presently from the back, so my precautions had not been needless. We were all three fair shots, though none of us up to Peter's miraculous standard, and the companions, too, made good practice. The Mauser was the weapon I knew best, and I didn't miss much. The attackers never had a chance, for their only hope was to rush us by numbers, and, the whole party being not above 24, they were far too few. I think we killed 3, for their bodies were left lying, and wounded at least 6, while the rest fell back towards the road. In a quarter of an hour it was all over. "They are dogs of Kurds," I heard Husin say fiercely. "Only a Kurdish gyar would fire on the livery of the Kaaba." Then I had a good look at Sandy. He had discarded shawls and wrappings, and stood up in the strangest costume man had ever worn in battle. Somehow he had procured field boots and an old pair of riding breeches. Above these, reaching well above his middle, he had a wonderful silken jibbah, or eppa, of bright emerald. I call it silk, but it was like no silk I had ever known, so exquisite in the mesh, with such sheen and depth in it. Some strange pattern was woven on the breast, which in the dim light I could not trace. I'll warrant no rarer or costlier garment was ever exposed to lead on oblique winter hill. Sandy seemed unconscious of his garb. His eye, listless no more, scanned the hollow. "That's only the overture," he cried. "The opera will soon begin. We must put a beastwork up in these gaps, or they'll pick us off from 1,000 yards." I had meantime roughly dressed Blenkiron's wound with a linen rag which Hughson produced. It was from a ricochet bullet which had clipped into his left shin. Then I took a hand with the others in getting up earthworks to complete the circuit of the defence. It was no easy job, for we wrought only with our knives and had to dig deep below the snowy gravel. As we worked, I took stock of our refuge. The kestrel was a rough circle about 10 yards in diameter, its interior filled with boulders and loose stones, and its parapet about 4 feet high. The mist had cleared for a considerable space, and I could see the immediate surroundings. West, beyond the hollow, was the road we had come, where now the remnants of the pursuit were clustered. North, the hill fell steeply to the valley bottom, but to the south, after a dip, there was a ridge which shut the view. East lay another fork of the stream, the chief fork I guessed, and it was evidently followed by the main road to the pass, for I saw it crowded with transport. The two roads seemed to converge somewhere farther south of my sight. I guessed we could not be very far from the front, for the noise of guns sounded very near, both the sharp crack of the field pieces and the deeper boom of the howitzers. More, I could hear the chatter of machine guns, a magpie note among the baying of hounds. I saw even the bursting of Russian shells, evidently trying to reach the main road. One big fellow, an 8-inch, landed not 10 yards from a convoy to the east of us, and another in the hollow through which we had come. These were clearly ranging shots, and I wondered if the Russians had observation posts on the heights to mark them. If so, they might soon try a curtain, and we should be very near its edge. It would be an odd irony if we were the target of friendly shells. "By the Lord Harry," I heard Sandy say, "if we had a brace of machine guns, we could hold this place against a division." "What price shells?" I asked. "If they get a gun up, they can blow us up to atoms in 10 minutes. "Please God the Russians keep them too busy for that," was his answer. With anxious eyes I watched our enemies on the road. They seemed to have grown in numbers. They were signaling, too, for a white flag fluttered. Then the mist rolled down on us again, and our prospect was limited to 10 yards of vapor. "Steady!" I cried. "They may try to rush us at any moment. Every man keep his eye on the ridge of the fog, and shoot at the first sign." For nearly half an hour by my watch we waited in that queer white world, our eyes smarting with the strain of peering. The sound of the guns seemed to be hushed, and everything grown deathly quiet. Blenkiron's squeal, as he knocked his wounded leg against a rock, made every man start. Then out of the mist there came a voice. It was a woman's voice, high, penetrating, and sweet, but it spoke in no tongue I knew. Only Sandy understood. He made a sudden movement as if to defend himself against a blow. The speaker came into clear sight on the glasses a yard or two away. Mine was the first face she saw. "I come to offer terms," she said in English. "Will you permit me to enter?" I could do nothing except take off my cap and say, "Yes, ma'am." Blenkiron, snuggled up against the parapet, was cursing furiously below his breath. She climbed up the krantz and stepped over the edge as lightly as a deer. Her clothes were strange, spurred boots and breeches over which fell a short green kirtle. A little cap, skewered with a jewelled pin, was on her head, and a cape of some coarse country cloth hung from her shoulders. She had rough gauntlets on her hands, and she carried for weapon a riding whip. The fog crystals clung to her hair, I remember, and a silvery film of fog lay on her garments. I had never before thought of her as beautiful. Strange, uncanny, wonderful, if you like, but the word beauty had too kindly and human a sound for such a face. But she stood with heightened colour, her eyes like stars, her poise like a wild bird's. I had to confess, she had her own loveliness. She might be a devil, but she was also a queen. I understood that there might be merits in the prospect of riding by her side into Jerusalem. Sandy stood rigid, his face very grave and set. She held out both hands to him, speaking softly in Turkish. I noticed that the 6 companions had disappeared from the cathedral, and were somewhere out of sight on the farther side. I do not know what she said, but from her tone, and above all from her eyes, I judged that she was pleading for his return, for his partnership in her great adventure, pleading, for all I knew, for his love. His expression was like a death mask, his brows drawn tight in a little frown and his jaw rigid. "Madam," he said, "I ask you to tell your business quick, and to tell it in English. My friends must hear it as well as me." "Your friends!" she cried. "What has a prince to do with these hirelings? Your slaves, perhaps, but not your friends." "My friends," Sandy repeated grimly. "You must know, madam, that I am a British officer." That was beyond doubt a clean, staggering stroke. What she had thought of his origin, God knows, but she had never dreamed of this. Her eyes grew larger and more lustrous. Her lips parted as if to speak, but her voice failed her. Then, by an effort, she recovered herself, and out of that strange face went all the glow of youth and ardour. It was again the unholy mask I had first known. "And these others?" she asked in a level voice. "One is a brother officer of my regiment. The other is an American friend. But all 3 of us are on the same errand. We came east to destroy Greenmantle and your devilish ambitions. You have yourself destroyed your prophets, and now it is your turn to fail and disappear. Make no mistake, madam, that folly is over. I will tear this sacred garment into 1,000 pieces and scatter them on the wind. The people wait today for the revelation, but none will come. You may kill us all if you can, but we have at least crushed a lie and done service to our country." I would not have taken my eyes from her face for a king's ransom. I have written that she was a queen, and of that there is no manner of doubt. She had the soul of a conqueror, for not a flicker of weakness or disappointment marred her air. Only pride and the stateliest resolution looked out of her eyes. "I said I come to offer terms. I will still offer them, though they are other than I thought. For the fat American I will send him home safely to his country. I do not make war on such as he. He is Germany's foe, not mine. You," she said, turning fiercely on me, "I will hang before dusk." Never in my life had I been so pleased. I had got my revenge at last. This woman had singled me out above the others as the object of her wrath, and I almost loved her for it. She turned to Sandy, and the fierceness went out of her face. "You seek the truth," she said, "and also do I. And if we use a lie, it is only to break down a greater. You are of my household in spirit, and you alone of all men I have seen are fit to ride with me in my mission. Germany may fail, but I shall not fail. I offer you the greatest career that mortal has known. I offer you a task which will need every atom of brain and sinew and courage. Will you refuse that task?" I do not know what effect this vapouring might have had in hot-scented rooms, or in the languor of some rich garden, but up on that cold hill-top it was as unsubstantial as mist around us. It sounded not even impressive, only crazy. "I stay with my friends," said Sandy. "Then I will offer more. I will save your friends. They, too, shall share in my triumph." This was too much for Blenkiron. He scrambled to his feet to speak the protest that had been wrung from his soul, forgot his game leg, and rolled back on the ground with a groan. Then she seemed to make a last appeal. She spoke in Turkish now, and I do not know what she said, but I judged that it was the plea of a woman to her lover. Once more she was the proud beauty, but there was a tremor in her pride. I had almost written tenderness. To listen to her was like horrid treachery, like eavesdropping on something pitiful. I know my cheeks grew scarlet, and Blenkiron turned away his head. Sandy's face did not move. He spoke in English. "You can offer me nothing that I desire," he said. I am the servant of my country, and her enemies are mine. I can have neither part nor lot with you. That is my answer, Madame von Einem." Then her steely restraint broke. It was like a dam giving before a pent-up mass of icy water. She tore off one of her gauntlets and hurled it in his face. Implacable hate looked out of her eyes. "I have done with you," she cried. "You have scorned me, but you have dug your own grave." She leapt on the parapet, and the next second was on the glacis. Once more the mist had fled, and across the hollow I saw a field gun in place, and men around it who were not Turkish. She waved her hand to them, and hastened down the hillside. But at that moment I heard the whistle of a long-range Russian shell. Among the boulders there was the dull shock of an explosion and a mushroom of red earth. It all passed in an instant of time. I saw the gunners on the road point their hands, and I heard them cry. I heard, too, a kind of sob from Blenkiron. All this before I had realized myself what had happened. The next thing I saw was Sandy, already behind the glacis, leaping with great bounds down the hill. They were shooting at him, but he heeded them not. For the space of a minute he was out of sight, and his whereabouts was shown only by the patter of bullets. Then he came back, walking quite slowly up the last slope, and he was carrying something in his arms. The enemy fired no more. They realized what had happened. He laid his burden down gently in a corner of the kestrel. The cap had fallen off, and the hair was breaking loose. The face was very white, but there was no wound or bruise on it. "She was killed at once," I heard him saying. "Her back was broken by a shell fragment. Dick, we must bury her here. You see, she liked me. I can make her no return but this." We set the companions to guard, and with infinite slowness, using our hands and our knives, we made a shallow grave below the eastern parapet. When it was done, we covered her face with a linen cloak which Sandy had worn that morning. He lifted the body and laid it reverently in its place. "I did not know that anything could be so light," he said. "It wasn't for me to look on at that kind of scene." I went to the parapet with Blenkiron's field glasses, and had a stare at our friends on the road. There was no Turk there, and I guessed why, for it would not be easy to use the men of Islam against the wearer of the green ephod. The enemy were German or Austrian, and they had a field gun. They seemed to have got it laid on our fort, but they were waiting. As I looked, I saw behind them a massive figure I seemed to recognize. Stoughton had come to see the destruction of his enemies. To the east I saw another gun in the fields just below the main road. They had got us on both sides, and there was no way of escape. Hilda von Einem was to have a noble pyre and goodly company for the dark journey. Dusk was falling now, a clear bright dusk, where the stars pricked through a sheen of amethyst. The artillery were busy all around the horizon, and towards the pass on the other road where Fort Palantuken stood, there was the dust and smoke of a furious bombardment. It seemed to me, too, that the guns on the other fronts had come nearer. Devboyen was hidden by a spur of hill, but up in the north white clouds, like the streamers of evening, were hanging over the Euphrates glen. The whole firmament hummed and twanged like a taut string that had been struck. As I looked, the gun to the west fired, the gun where Stoughton was. The shell dropped 10 yards to our right. A second later, another fell behind us. Blenkiron had draped himself over the parapet. I don't suppose he had ever been shelled before, but his face showed curiosity rather than fear. "Pretty lousy shooting, I reckon," he said. "On the contrary," I said, "they know their business. They're bracketing." The words were not out of my mouth when one fell right among us. It struck the far rim of the kestrel, shattering the rock, but bursting mainly outside. We all ducked, and barring some small scratches, no one was a penny the worse. I remember that much of the debris fell on Hilda von Einem's grave. I pulled Blenkiron over the far parapet and called on the rest to follow, meaning to take cover on the rough side of the hill. But as we showed ourselves, shots rang out from our front, shots fired from a range of a few hundred yards. It was easy to see what had happened. Riflemen had been sent to hold us in rear. They would not assault so long as we remained in the kestrel, but they would block any attempt to find safety outside it. Stoughton and his gun had us at their mercy. We crouched below the parapet again. "We may as well toss for it," I said. "There's only two ways. To stay here and be shelled, or try to break through those fellows behind. Either's pretty unhealthy." But I knew there was no choice. With Blenkiron crippled, we were pinned to the castrol. Our numbers were up all right.
Chapter 22. The Guns of the North. But no more shells fell. The night grew dark, and showed a field of glittering stars, for the air was sharpening again towards frost. We waited for an hour, crouching just behind the far parapets, but never came that ominous, familiar whistle. Then Sandy rose and stretched himself. "I'm hungry," he said. "Let's have out the food, Hussein. We've eaten nothing since before daybreak. I wonder what is the meaning of this respite." I fancied I knew. "It's Stoom's way," I said. "He wants to torture us. He'll keep us hours on tenterhooks while he sits over yonder exulting in what he thinks we're enduring. He has just enough imagination for that. He would rush us if he had the men. As it is, he's going to blow us to pieces, but do it slowly and smack his lips over it." Sandy yawned. "We'll disappoint him, for we won't be worried, old man. We three are beyond that kind of fear." "Meanwhile, we're going to do the best we can," I said. "He's got the exact range for his whiz-bangs. We've got to find a hole somewhere just outside the castrol, and some sort of head cover. We're bound to get damaged, whatever happens, but we'll stick it out to the end. When they think they have finished with us and rush the place, there may be one of us alive to put a bullet through old Stoom. What do you say?" They agreed, and after our meal Sandy and I crawled out to a prospect, leaving the others on guard in case there should be an attack. We found a hollow in the glossy a little south of the castrol, and, working very quietly, managed to enlarge it, and cut a kind of shallow cave in the hill. It would be no use against a direct hit, but it would give some cover from flying fragments. As I read the situation, Stoom could land as many shells as he pleased in the castrol, and wouldn't bother to attend to the flanks. When the bad shelling began, there would be shelter for one or two in the cave. Our enemies were watchful. The riflemen on the east burnt very flares at intervals, and Stoom's lot sent up a great star rocket. I remember that just before midnight hell broke loose round Fort Palantuken. No more Russian shells came into our hollow, but all the road to the east was under fire, and at the fort itself there was a shattering explosion and a queer scarlet glow which looked as if a magazine had been hit. For about 2 hours the firing was intense, and then it died down. But it was towards the north that I kept turning my head. There seemed to be something different in the sound there, something sharper in the report of the guns, as if shells were dropping in a narrow valley whose rock walls doubled the echo. Had the Russians by any blessed chance worked round that flank? I got Sandy to listen, but he shook his head. "Those guns are a dozen miles off," he said. "They're no nearer than 3 days ago. But it looks as if the sportsmen on the south might have a chance. When they break through and stream down the valley, they'll be puzzled to account for what remains of us. We're no longer 3 adventurers in the enemy's country. We're the advance guard of the Allies. Our pals don't know about us, and we're going to be cut off, which has happened to advance guards before now. But all the same, we're in our own battle line again. Doesn't that cheer you, Dick?" It cheered me wonderfully, for I knew now what had been the weight on my heart ever since I accepted Sir Walter's mission. It was the loneliness of it. I was fighting far away from my friends, far away from the true fronts of battle. It was a sideshow which, whatever its importance, had none of the exhilaration of the main effort. But now we had come back to familiar ground. We were like the Highlanders cut off at Sint-Saint-Auguste on the first day of Loos, or those Scots guards at Festubert of whom I had heard. Only the others did not know of it, would never hear of it. If Peter succeeded, he might tell the tale, but most likely he was lying dead somewhere in the no-man's land between the lines. We should never be heard of again any more, but our work remained. Sir Walter would know that, and he would tell our few belongings that we had gone out in our country's service. We were in the castrol again, sitting under the parapets. The same thoughts must have been in Sandy's mind, for he suddenly laughed. "It's a queer ending, Dick. We simply vanish into the infinite. If the Russians get through, they will never recognize what is left of us among so much of the wreckage of battle. The snow will soon cover us, and when the spring comes there will only be a few bleached bones. Upon my soul, it is the kind of death I always wanted." And he quoted softly to himself a verse of an old Scots ballad. "Many's the one for him makes moan, but none shall ken where he is gone. O'er his white banes, when they are bare, the wind shall blow for evermair." "But our work lives," I cried, with a sudden great gasp of happiness. "It's the job that matters, not the men that do it. And our job's done. We have won, old chap, won, hands down, and there's no going back on that. We have won, anyway, and if Peter has had a slice of luck, we've scooped the pool. After all, we never expected to come out of this thing with our lives." Blenkiron, with his legs stuck out stiffly before him, was humming quietly to himself, as he often did when he felt cheerful. He had only one song, John Brown's Body, usually only a line at a time, but now he got as far as the whole verse. "He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true, and he frightened old Virginie till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves the traitor crew, but his soul goes marching along." "Feeling good?" I asked. "Fine. I'm about the luckiest man on God's earth, Major. I've always wanted to get into a big show, but I didn't see how it would come the way of a homely citizen like me living in a steam-warmed house and going downtown to my office every morning. I used to envy my old dad that fought at Chattanooga and never forgot to tell you about it. But I guess Chattanooga was like a scrap in a Bowery bar compared to this. When I meet the old man in glory, he'll have to listen some to me." It was just after Blenkiron spoke that we got a reminder of Sturm's presence. The gun was well laid, for a shell plumped on the near edge of the castrol. It made an end of one of the companions who was on guard there, badly wounded another, and a fragment gashed my thigh. We took refuge in the shallow cave, but some wild shooting from the east side brought us back to the parapets, for we feared an attack. None came, nor any more shells, and once again the night was quiet. I asked Blenkiron if he had any near relatives. "Why, no, except a sister's son, a college boy who has no need of his uncle. It's fortunate that we three have no wives. I haven't any regrets neither, for I've had a mighty deal out of life. I was thinking this morning that it was a pity I was going out when I had just got my duodenum to listen to reason. But I reckon that's another of my mercies. The good God took away the pain in my stomach so that I might go to him with a clear head and a thankful heart." "We're lucky fellows," said Sandy. "We've all had our whack. When I remember the good times I've had, I could sing a hymn of praise. We've lived long enough to know ourselves, and to shape ourselves into some kind of decency. But think of those boys who have given their lives freely when they scarcely knew what life meant. They were just at the beginning of the road, and they didn't know what dreary bits lay before them. It was all sunshiny and bright-colored, and yet they gave it up without a moment's doubt. And think of the men with wives and children and homes that were the biggest things in life to them. For fellows like us to shirk would be black cowardice. It's small credit for us to stick it out. But when those others shut their teeth and went forward, they were blessed heroes." After that we fell silent. A man's thoughts at a time like that seem to be double-powered, and the memory becomes very sharp and clear. I don't know what was in the others' minds, but I know what filled my own. I fancy it isn't the men who get most out of the world and are always buoyant and cheerful that most fear to die. Rather, it is the weak-engined souls who go about with dull eyes that cling most fiercely to life. They have not the joy of being alive, which is a kind of earnest of immortality. I know that my thoughts were chiefly about the jolly things that I had seen and done, not regret, but gratitude. The panorama of blue noons on the veld unrolled itself before me, and hunters' nights in the bush, the taste of food and sleep, the bitter stimulus of dawn, the joy of wild adventure, the voices of old staunch friends. Hitherto the war had seemed to make a break with all that had gone before, but now the war was only part of the picture. I thought of my battalion, and the good fellows there, many of whom had fallen on the loose parapets. I had never looked to come out of that myself, But I had been spared and given the chance of a greater business, and I had succeeded. That was the tremendous fact, and my mood was humble gratitude to God and exultant pride. Death was a small price to pay for it. As Blenkiron would have said, I had got good value in the deal. The night was getting bitter cold, as happens before dawn. It was frost again, and the sharpness of it woke our hunger. I got out the remnants of the food and wine, and we had a last meal. I remember we pledged each other as we drank. "We have eaten our Passover feast," said Sandy. "When do you look for the end?" "After dawn," I said. "Stoom wants daylight to get the full savour of his revenge." Slowly the sky passed from ebony to grey, and black shapes of hill outlined themselves against it. A wind blew down the valley, bringing the acrid smell of burning, but something too of the freshness of morn. It stirred strange thoughts in me, and woke the old morning vigour of the blood which was never to be mine again. For the first time in that long vigil I was torn with a sudden regret. "We must get into the cave before it is full light," I said. "We had better draw lots for the two to go." The choice fell on one of the companions and Blenkiron. "You can count me out," said the latter. "If it's your wish to find a man to be alive when our friends come up to count their spoil, I guess I'm the worst of the lot. I'd prefer, if you don't mind, to stay here. I've made my peace with my Maker, and I'd like to wait quietly on his call. I'll play a game of patience to pass the time." He would take no denial, so we drew again, and the lot fell to Sandy. "If I'm the last to go," he said, "I promise I don't miss. Stoom won't be long in following me." He shook hands with his cheery smile, and he and the companion slipped over the parapet in the final shadows before dawn. Blenkiron spread his patience cards on a flat rock and dealt out the double Napoleon. He was perfectly calm and hummed to himself his only tune. For myself, I was drinking in my last draught of the hill air. My contentment was going. I suddenly felt bitterly loath to die. Something of the same kind must have passed through Blenkiron's head. He suddenly looked up and asked, Sister Anne, do you see anybody coming?" I stood close to the parapet, watching every detail of the landscape as shown by the revealing daybreak. Up on the shoulders of the Palantuken, snowdrifts lipped over the edges of the cliffs. I wondered when they would come down as avalanches. There was a kind of croft on one hillside, and from a hut the smoke of breakfast was beginning to curl. Stoom's gunners were awake, and apparently holding council. Far down on the main road a convoy was moving. I heard the creak of the wheels 2 miles away, for the air was deathly still. Then, as if a spring had been loosed, the world suddenly leaped to a hideous life. With a growl the guns opened round all the horizon. They were especially fierce to the south, where a rafale beat, as I had never heard it before. The one glance I cast behind me showed the gap in the hills choked with fumes and dust. But my eyes were on the north. From Erzurum city tall tongues of flame leaped from a dozen quarters. Beyond, towards the opening of the Euphrates glen, there was the sharp crack of field guns. I strained eyes and ears, mad with impatience, and I read the riddle. "Sandy," I yelled, "Peter has got through! The Russians are round the flank! The town is burning! Glory to God, we've won! We've won!" And as I spoke the earth seemed to split beside me, and I was flung forward on the gravel which covered Hilda von Einem's grave. As I picked myself up, and to my amazement found myself uninjured, I saw Blenkiron rubbing the dust out of his eyes and arranging a disordered card. He had stopped humming, and was singing aloud. "He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true, and he frightened old Virginny. Say, Major," he cried, "I believe this game of mine is coming out." I was now pretty well mad. The thought that old Peter had won, that we had won beyond our wildest dreams, that if we died there were those coming who would exact the uttermost vengeance, rode my brain like fever. I sprang on the parapet and waved my hand to Stoom, shouting defiance. Rifle shots cracked out from behind, and I leaped back just in time for the next shell. The charge must have been short, for it was a bad miss, landing somewhere on the glossy. The next was better, and crashed on the near parapet, carving a great hole in the rocky kranz. This time my arm hung limp, broken by a fragment of stone, but I felt no pain. Blenkiron seemed to bear a charmed life, for he was smothered in dust, but unhurt. He blew the dust away from his cards very gingerly, and went on playing. "Sister Anne," he asked, "do you see anybody coming?" Then came a dud which dropped neatly inside on the soft ground. I was determined to break for the open and chance the rifle fire, for if Stoom went on shooting, the Castrol was certain death. I caught Blenkiron round the middle, scattering his cards to the winds, and jumped over the parapet. "Don't apologize, Sister Anne," said he. "The game was as good as won. But for God's sake drop me, for if you wave me like the banner of freedom, I'll get plugged sure and good." My one thought was to get cover for the next minutes, for I had an instinct that our vigil was near its end. The defences of Erzurum were crumbling like sand castles, and it was a proof of the tenseness of my nerves that I seemed to be deaf to the sound. Stoom had seen us cross the parapet, and he started to sprinkle all the surroundings of the Castrol. Blenkiron and I lay like a working party between the lines caught by machine guns, taking a pull on ourselves as best we could. Sandy had some kind of cover, but we were on the bare farther slope, and the riflemen on that side might have had us at their mercy. But no shots came from them. As I looked east, the hillside, which a little before had been held by our enemies, was as empty as the desert. And then I saw on the main road a sight which for a second time made me yell like a maniac. Down that glen came a throng of men and galloping limbers, a crazy, jostling crowd, spreading away beyond the road to the steep slopes, and leaving behind it many black dots to darken the snows. The gates of the south had yielded, and our friends were through them. At that sight I forgot all about our danger. I didn't give a cent for Stoom's shells. I didn't believe he could hit me. The fate which had mercifully preserved us for the first taste of victory would see us through to the end. I remember bundling Blenkiron along the hill to find Sandy, but our news was anticipated, for down our own side glen came the same broken tumult of men. More, for at their backs, far up at the throat of the pass, I saw horsemen, the horsemen of the pursuit. Old Nicholas had flung his cavalry in. Sandy was on his feet, with his lips set and his eye abstracted. If his face hadn't been burned black by the weather, it would have been pale as a dishclout. A man like him doesn't make up his mind for death and then be given his life again without being wrenched out of his bearings. I thought he didn't understand what had happened, so I beat him on the shoulders. "Man, d'ye see?" I cried. "The Cossacks! The Cossacks! God, how they're taking that slope! They're into them now. By heaven, we'll ride with them. We'll get the gun horses." A little knoll prevented Stoom and his men from seeing what was happening farther up the glen, till the first wave of the rout was on them. He had gone on bombarding the Castrol and its environs while the world was cracking over his head. The gun team was in the hollow below the road, and down the hill among the boulders we crawled, Blenkiron as lame as a duck, and me with a limp left arm. The poor beasts were straining at their pickets and sniffing the morning wind, which brought down the thick fumes of the great bombardment and the indescribable babbling cries of a beaten army. Before we reached them, that maddened horde had swept down on them, men panting and gasping in their flight, many of them bloody from wounds, many tottering in the first stages of collapse and death. I saw the horses seized by a dozen hands, and a desperate fight for their possession. But as we halted there, our eyes were fixed on the battery on the road above us, for round it was now sweeping the van of the retreat. I had never seen a rout before, when strong men come to the end of their tether, and only their broken shadows stumble towards the refuge they never find. No more had Stoom, poor devil. I had no ill will left for him, though coming down that hill I was rather hoping that the two of us might have a final scrap. He was a brute and a bully, but by God, he was a man. I heard his great roar when he saw the tumult, and the next I saw was his monstrous figure working at the gun. He swung it south and turned it on the fugitives. But he never fired it. The press was on him, and the gun was swept sideways. He stood up a foot higher than any of them, and he seemed to be trying to check the rush with his pistol. There is power in numbers, even though every unit is broken and fleeing. For a second to that wild crowd Stoom was the enemy, and they had strength enough to crush him. The wave flowed round and then across him. I saw the butt ends of rifles crash on his head and shoulders, and the next second the stream had passed over his body. That was God's judgment on the man who had set himself above his kind. Sandy gripped my shoulder and was shouting in my ear. "They're coming, Dick! Look at the grey devils! Oh, God be thanked it's our friends!" The next minute we were tumbling down the hillside, Blenkiron hopping on one leg between us. I heard dimly Sandy crying, "Oh, well done, our side!" and Blenkiron declaiming about Harper's Ferry, but I had no voice at all, and no wish to shout. I know the tears were in my eyes, and that if I had been left alone I would have sat down and cried with pure thankfulness. For sweeping down the glen came a cloud of grey cavalry on little wiry horses, a cloud which stayed not for the rear of the fugitives, but swept on like a flight of rainbows, with the steel of their lance heads glittering in the winter sun. They were riding for Erzurum. Remember that for 3 months we had been with the enemy, and had never seen the face of an ally in arms. We had been cut off from the fellowship of a great cause, like a fort surrounded by an army. And now we were delivered, and there fell around us the warm joy of comradeship, as well as the exultation of victory. We flung caution to the winds, and went stark mad. Sandy, still in his emerald coat and turban, was scrambling up the farther slope of the hollow, yelling greetings in every language known to man. The leader saw him, with a word checked his men for a moment. It was marvellous to see the horses reined in such a breakneck ride, and from the squadron 6 troopers swung loose and wheeled towards us. Then a man in a grey overcoat and a sheepskin cap was on the ground beside us, wringing our hands. "You are safe, my old friends." It was Peter's voice that spoke. "I will take you back to our army, and get you breakfast." "No, by the Lord, you won't," cried Sandy. "We've had the rough end of the job, and now we'll have the fun. Look after Blenkiron and these fellows of mine. I'm going to ride knee by knee with your sportsmen for the city." Peter spoke a word, and 2 of the Cossacks dismounted. The next I knew I was mixed up in the cloud of greycoats, galloping down the road up which the morning before we had strained to the castrol. That was the great hour of my life, and to live through it was worth a dozen years of slavery. With a broken left arm I had little hold on my beast, so I trusted my neck to him and let him have his will. Black with dirt and smoke, hatless, with no kind of uniform, I was a wilder figure than any Cossack. I soon was separated from Sandy, who had 2 hands and a better horse, and seemed resolute to press forward to the very van. That would have been suicide for me, and I had all I could do to keep my place in the bunch I rode with. But, great God, what an hour it was! There was loose shooting on our flank, but nothing to trouble us, though the gun team of some Austrian howitzer, struggling madly at a bridge, gave us a bit of a tussle. Everything flitted past me like smoke, or like the mad finale of a dream just before waking. I knew the living movement under me, and the companionship of men, but all dimly, for at heart I was alone, grappling with the realization of a new world. I felt the shadows of the Palantuken glen fading, and the great burst of light as we emerged on the wider valley. Somewhere before us was a pall of smoke seamed with red flames, and beyond the darkness of still higher hills. All that time I was dreaming, crooning daft catches of song to myself, so happy, so deliriously happy that I dared not try to think. I kept muttering a kind of prayer made up of Bible words to Him who had shown me His goodness in the land of the living. But as we drew out from the skirts of the hills and began the long slope to the city, I woke to clear consciousness. I felt the smell of sheepskin and lathered horses, and above all the bitter smell of fire. Down in the trough lay Erzurum, now burning in many pieces, and from the east, past the silent forts, horsemen were closing in on it. I yelled to my comrades that we were nearest, that we would be first in the city, and they nodded happily and shouted their strange war cries. As we topped the last ridge I saw below me the van of our charge, a dark mass on the snow, while the broken enemy on both sides were flinging away their arms and scattering in the fields. In the very front, now nearing the city ramparts, was one man. He was like the point of the steel spear soon to be driven home. In the clear morning air I could see that he did not wear the uniform of the invaders. He was turbaned and rode like one possessed, and against the snow I caught the dark sheen of emerald. As he rode, it seemed that the fleeing Turks were stricken still, and sank by the roadside with eyes strained after his unheeding figure. Then I knew that the prophecy had been true, and that their prophet had not failed them. The long-looked-for revelation had come. Greenmantle had appeared at last to an awaiting people.